What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so continuing our discussions on the Dark Multiverse, we pick up with the Wild Hunt, and this is actually really good because one of the questions that I've seen from you guys, and one of the questions I've been wondering myself is, how does Barbados seize the multiverse? That's the overarching goal of Barbados when it comes to like everything that goes on in Dark Knight's Metal. That Barbados, you have like the whole World Forge and everything that's really was designed to kind of create worlds, create universes, and then send those out into the multiverse. But those universes that were deemed to be too corrupt or too evil were quote unquote discarded. But the idea was that with Barbados, kind of abandoning his post and then seeking to effectively conquer the multiverse, the question was, how would he pull it off? Because he tried it once before, right? Like we talked about that in Dark Knight's Metal before in the previous videos. He was defeated by Hawkman, and then that led Hawkman to really ask the question, what's the nature of this nth metal which sent him on his whole journey? When it comes to the multiverse, the issue was, how do they take it? I mean, there is like a heart of the multiverse. There's a place that you can go where you can effectively kind of synthesize a poison of sorts that would spread throughout the other worlds. But the question is, how are they going to pull it off? Is it really just Barbados going there and then just kind of like shouting really loud and then just dispersing his power across the cosmos? Is that really how that whole thing works? Well, the cool thing about this is that this answers the question. This really kind of gives us an explanation of how it is the multiverse will effectively fall. Now, one thing that we do here, at least how we initially pick up, is really like, it's kind of strange with the origin of Detective Chimp. With regards to this origin, it seems to me that DC is grabbing a combination of a couple different things. The first is DC Comics Presents number 85, I think, back in 1981, and then the Days of Vengeance storyline. Now, the DC Comics Presents stories, actually I think it's 35. Now that I think about it, I don't think it's 85. But anyway, the DC Comics Presents story is actually pre-Crisis. That's before Crisis on Infinite Earths, so we don't really have to run with that. Days of Vengeance was basically a story that was written by DC as a lead up to Infinite Crisis. Remember, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC still had a lot of continuity errors, and so because of that, a lot of the stories like 0 Hour Crisis in Time and things like that were designed to kind of wrap up those stories, or at the very least provide new origins or updated origins for characters that didn't really have them after the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And for the character of Detective Chimp, that was one of those things. And for the most part, this origin seems to fall closely in line. It even goes all the way back to like Rex the Wonder Dog back in 1952. I think it was number 4 with John Broome and Carmine Infantino. But there was the whole idea that basically Detective Chimp is just like a chimpanzee that was taken by a guy named Fred Thorpe. In this instance, it seems like he's kind of stuck in a shanty town, or at the very least, some sort of a carnival attraction. But the idea is that somewhere along the line, you ended up having Fred Thorpe, who was basically killed, and there was no real understanding as to why. Instead, Bobo, really is what his name is, was just kind of there as an attraction, and he was simply just a simian. He was just a chimp. There was really nothing special about him. But following the death of Fred Thorpe and the idea that he effectively left the cage unlocked and gave Bobo a chance to escape, he ultimately came into contact with Rex the Wonder Dog. Now again, this really goes back to 1952, and that's why I say DC's grabbing all kinds of different things, all kinds of different aspects from over the course of the publication history of Detective Chimp. Back with Rex the Wonder Dog in 1952, this was really one of those things we've talked about before, where DC was kind of focusing more on like science fiction as opposed to traditional superhero stories. And for the most part, Rex the Wonder Dog was actually really popular. Like he ran for like 46 issues or something like that. It was a huge deal. Like people loved his character. But effectively, what ends up happening is that Detective Chimp is taken to the Fountain of Youth, which basically grants him eternal youth, as well as the ability to communicate with all form of animals that are out there. And this, of course, leads him on a quest to basically, figure out who it was that murdered Fred Thorpe, which ultimately led to the incarceration of those guys. 2 were executed and 1 was killed in prison. But this kind of set Detective Chimp on the path of becoming a detective. Now, one thing to bear in mind about his character, and the reason why you really haven't seen him a whole lot in DC Rebirth, is because for the most part, when it comes to Detective Chimp and the various magical creatures, he's kind of intertwined in the whole like Vertigo side of things. So like Trigun and like, Hellblazer and like the Spectre and things like that. Detective Chimp is kind of like that other side, that whole magical side that we've talked about before, that doesn't really cross over all that often with the main superhero lineup of DC. And so what we end up doing is we basically end up finding out a lot of this is taking place on Black Hawk Island. Now remember, Black Hawk Island was the residence of Lady Black Hawk, essentially the girlfriend of Hawkman. And the idea was that somewhere along the line, you ended up having, again, Hawkman going on this quest, and then you ended up having his girl basically staying behind and trying to figure out everything that was going on. Hawk Girl, for lack of a better word. She was trying to figure out everything that was happening. Now, where her journey led her alongside like Wonder Woman, taking off to like the Rock of Eternity, eternity, trying to figure out what was going on, going to the heart of the multiverse. What this does is it basically says there are still survivors here. There are still beings who are kind of floating around. And one of these guys is Professor Morrow. Now, Professor Morrow is the creator of Red Tornado. And Red Tornado is basically the Vision before the Vision in Marvel Comics. So he has like all these really cool abilities and different things like that. But it's one of those examples where DC kind of created the standard, and then Marvel basically took it, copied it, borrowed it, whatever phrase you want to use, depending on how much you like or dislike Marvel. But the fact remains, when it comes to this whole scenario, because of the fact that the events of Dark Knights Metal have meant that reality is effectively breaking down inside the main DC universe, what it means is that this is having a wide array of different effects. In some instances, there's a physical change in reality itself. In other instances, when it comes to characters like Detective Chimp, his intelligence is effectively starting to go away, where he's basically reverting back into a simian again. So it's just one of those things that kind of feeds into the collapse of the universe, so to speak. The problem with this is that what they're also doing is they're basically trying to get in touch with something called the Ultima Thule. Now, the Ultima Thule we've talked about before, and that was really part of Grant Morrison's Multiversity. When it came to the whole Multiversity line of stories, and we have a video on this that you're welcome to check out, so we won't go super in-depth into this, but when it came to Multiversity, the idea was that Grant Morrison wrote Final Crisis, and where Infinite Crisis brought the multiverse back, Final Crisis made the heroes aware of it. And so what Grant Morrison wanted to do with the post-Final Crisis landscape was basically tell stories of the multiverse. And it was a way for him to just kind of continue writing for DC and do it in a way that didn't really impact the main DC universe. He could just kind of tell these crazy, zonky stories, and some of them were actually really, 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 really good. But the whole idea is that the Ultima Thule is a vessel that's used to travel from one universe to the other. Because remember, in DC, universes are separated by harmonic frequencies. That's how like the Flash, kind of jumps from one universe to another, is that he basically vibrates at the frequency of another universe. So if you were to sit down at a piano and you were to hit one of the keys, that sound would be like the main DC universe. And if you hit another key, that sound might be, the Injustice universe. And if you hit another key, that sound might be like the DC cinematic universe. And as long as you can vibrate at that frequency, at the sound of that note, you can travel to that universe. Again, it's really interesting in terms of how it works, but it can be a little confusing if you're relatively new to it. Now, in between all these different universes is what's called the bleed. It gets kind of crazy and it gets kind of wild. I've always likened it to like blood cells, in the sense that you have like red blood cells that float around the human body, and the red blood cells are just different universes. The blood that carries the red blood cells is the bleed. That's basically the space in between. And that's how you travel. You can usually jump into the bleed and then go throughout the bleed and then travel to a particular universe and then vibrate at the right frequency and go into that universe. That's what the Ultima Thule does. But what they're looking for is the House of Heroes. And the House of Heroes is where the Multiversal Justice League resides at. Remember, we covered that both as part of Multiversity as well as the whole lead up to like Superman Reborn. This idea that there is kind of a Justice League that exists out there that's composed of various forms of the superheroes that we've seen from all throughout the multiverse. A female version of Aquaman, you have the President of the United States on one universe who's also Superman. There's a lot of these cool themes that go on with those different groups. But the idea, remember, the idea of Flash and Cyborg was to travel into the multiverse, or really alongside Raven, was to travel into the multiverse and find help. Now, this was kind of DC teasing the idea that maybe there's superheroes who were trapped out there in the multiverse, or at the very least, just bringing back those multiversity concepts. But what we end up finding out here is that in addition to them basically traveling to these other universes, they're also being tracked by the forces of Barbados. And this is cool because what Barbados's forces are doing are firing these various missiles at the Ultima Thule. Now, I want you to keep in mind, because that's going to be very, very important. That's going to be a major thing when we get later on down the line towards the end of this story. But traveling into the multiverse, what ends up happening is that because they're effectively under attack, it's one of these things where it's like, okay, so like we got to get out of here as fast as possible. And they basically end up showing up in a universe, or I guess on an Earth, where everything kind of exists in the realms of like pirates and things like that, where you have like Pirate Batman and, the Pirate Justice League and different things along those lines. But it is cool and it is interesting because this brings into sharp relief the nature of Raven. With Raven basically being the daughter of Trigon, being the daughter of a demon, her powers are vast and they're extreme. And it is really cool because where you end up having Dawnbreaker Batman who shows up, basically, once they start to board the ship and they start attacking everybody, what ends up happening is that Raven actually seizes control of them. And that's cool. And I mean, look at this. That's what's so beast about this. She's like, my dad's a demon, make your little constructs and we'll see what happens because you do not scare a daughter of hell. And that's why people love Raven, because Raven's one of those characters where if you go back and you read her comics, she's like kind of like, emo, and she kind of mopes around all the time and she's sad. But like, if there's anybody you want in in your corner in a fight, it's Raven. Like, she's hardcore, and it's so cool because it's one of these things that takes the Dark Knights by surprise. Like, they don't initially realize what's going on. They're kind of shocked by the whole thing. Like, how is this girl able to, seize control of my constructs? The other half of this is the nature of how it is the Dark Knights were able to transition from, into the bleed and basically chase this group from one universe to the next. What they've done is they've basically empowered their ship using a miniature universe that hasn't really grown into its infancy yet. And what they've been doing is using a massive amount of power to keep this universe contained, to keep it small so it can be used as an energy source. If this power were to be released, if this control were to be destroyed more or less, the universe would just start growing rapidly, and just start forming life and different things like that. And it is kind of interesting because what ends up happening here is that where you have like Barry Allen, who's basically trying to find this universe and essentially destroy it, once he locates it, uses his super speed, gets around the Merciless, a lot of these guys, he's met by the arrival of Red Death. But this is cool because Red Death shows up a second too late, like a split second too late, and Barry destroys this universe. And what it means is that Red Death is basically blasted with all this energy of a positive universe, and it kind of shifts his polarity, for lack of a better word. And so instead of Red Death basically being an evil version of like Batman who became the Flash, instead the Red Death becomes a good version of Barry Allen with the Batman persona cast off, who becomes the Reverse Flash. So it's awesome. It's so cool because I'll be honest with you guys, he looks amazing. A golden version of Red Death? You cannot tell me with a straight face that does not look awesome. Like, that looks so beast. I want to see Barry Allen in that. You know what? I want to see Godspeed in that outfit. That's how I want to see Godspeed. It looks so awesome and it looks so cool. But what this means is that this version of Barry, I guess this Red Death, is really like a good guy now. It's kind of shifted him to becoming a positive being. Now again, that's because the evil Batman persona was sort of cast off. And that's the important thing to bear in mind here. These Dark Knights, they're basically Bruce Wayne, or a version of Bruce Wayne that succumbed to evil. When it came to Red Death, he was two beings. He was Barry Allen, who was merged with Batman when Batman used Barry Allen and entered the Speed Force, kind of used Barry Allen as a key to jump into the Speed Force and then merge them together into a singular being, with Bruce Wayne being the dominant personality. With that Bruce Wayne essence kind of being obliterated by all the positive energy that's there, what it means is that all you have left is the Flash. Now, this kind of begs the question, is this an answer to how it is you can destroy the Dark Knights and destroy Barbados? It is, but it isn't. This was a singular universe, a baby universe that was used to basically destroy a Batman persona, to kind of wipe it away by exposing it to all this positive energy. It's entirely possible DC could use that, but the problem you run into is that it sort of brings in the idea that you'd have to like destroy everything. You'd have to obliterate the multiverse in order to destroy Barbados and then bring the multiverse back. And even then, it seems like there'd be no guarantee the multiverse would return the way it did before, or that Barbados wouldn't return the way he did before. So again, it is pretty ambiguous. I mean, this is part of this, I imagine, is kind of like the Grant Morrison aspect of the story coming out as opposed to Scott Snyder or Joshua Williamson. And it is pretty interesting and it does work. The problem with this is that in order to basically destroy the sphere of expansion, so to speak, of the Dark Knights, somebody has to stay behind and basically allow this baby universe to kind of grow and to continue to expand and all that kind of good stuff. The issue with this is that when the various members who were here, the actual Flash, Barry Allen, Cyborg, when you have Raven, when they all basically depart after the quote unquote defeat of the various members of the Dark Knights, we end up finding out this was all part of the plan. The various missiles that were being fired at this group by the Dark Knights, they contained baby dark universes. And so what this means is that the group has basically traveled with the Dark Knights following after them. They traveled into the bleed, and all these dark universes are going to start spreading throughout the bleed and impacting directly with the positive multiverses. So again, it's crazy because it kind of brings in this idea that like, this is how things have been going this whole time. And that's what ends up happening here. Back on Black Hawk Island, we end up picking up with Detective Chimp. And again, where his mental faculties are kind of eroding, where he's becoming less and less smart, with the last little tidbits of, knowledge that he has, he basically frees Red Tornado because his idea is Red Tornado knows something. There's something that went on here that led to him basically being captured by the Blackhawks. And when he was originally released, he started shouting things like, you open the door, you have to close the door. And then they shut him down immediately because he started going awry, but he was never allowed to finish his thought. And so the idea of Detective Chimp is let Red Tornado talk. Let him tell us, at the very least, what he knows and what's going on. And so what this does is it brings in the idea that all of this has happened before and all of this has happened again. The whole idea was that when you had the original journey of Hawkman, Carter Hall, who went on this journey to find out what was going on with Nth Metal, that all this basically took place. That what you had was Carter Hall learning the nature of Nth Metal, learning about the dark multiverse, learning about the desire of Barbados to enter the positive multiverse, that there was a mission just like the one they went on, where it was Red Tornado and all these forces who went into the bleed, who were trying to find a way to basically eliminate the sphere of influence of Barbados, or at the very least, figure out out what was happening. The result was that his forces were almost successful, but Red Tornado and company were able to close the door off. The issue is that Barry Allen and them haven't done that. They opened the door for Barbados to come in, and now it's effectively too late. There's really no way to stop the collapse of everything. Instead, it's all basically gonna come crashing down. That this last little vestige of hope they had of being able to get out into the multiverse, of being able to find help, to find people who could basically take out Barbados, that it's all essentially gone. That there's nothing really there. That once they make it to the Hall of Heroes, the Hall of Heroes has been corrupted. It's been completely and totally taken over. And so it's wild, because it basically means there's nothing to help them here. It seems like there's no real hope. But what ends up happening is that in these last few minutes, the group basically discovers Earth 53, an Earth that's not supposed to exist. And when they do, we end up having like the mind of Detective Chimp that's basically kind of teleported away. It's essentially grabbed and then taken to this new universe whereby everybody is an ape. You have like Monkey Batman and Monkey Aquaman and Monkey Superman and so on and so forth. And these guys are effectively going to be one part of the many groups who exist out there that are essentially going to take on the force of Barbados. That seems to be the conclusion that Scott Snyder's going in. That the heroes that resided in the Hall of Heroes, that multiversal Justice League, are likely still alive, and they'll likely be found, which means we'll probably start finding other Supermen from other universes. I really hope we see the return of Shazam, but it'll be kind of like this almost Final Crisis-esque scenario where we'll have like this huge amalgamation of superheroes from all across the multiverse who will show up and try to take out Barbados. But that just kind of seems to be the case. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.